In the last episode of CI Stories, we have seen how scientists interact on a scientific conference, and in this episode I want to tell you a little bit more about how we also interact, especially in the form of scientific publications. If we are publishing, that is something completely different to what happens in newspapers from journalists. We are not just a random politician that is tweeting his news out on Twitter, but scientific publication is actually a part of the process of the generation of knowledge. And essential building block of this generation of knowledge is the so-called peer review process. And what that means is that before any of what we are putting out to the world actually gets published, it gets checked by a lot of our colleagues, at least two other independent colleagues, if not even more, until they are happy with the content to be published, so that the larger scientific community actually agrees on this content. So you can see this is significantly different from just a journalist who can write his opinion and nobody is checking up what he's writing. But let's go back one step. Why do we even publish? Well, of course, this is the last step of the scientific method, and it is a very important step because we need to tell others about our results. If we don't publish and don't tell anybody about what the nice things we found out, then nobody can benefit from what we learned. So it's very important that we publish that. And we do that in peer-reviewed international journals. The other thing is that for us scientists, publications are kind of our currency in which we are measured and evaluated. So whenever a scientist is applying for a position or some grant funding, the evaluation will take into account how many publications he has been writing, and especially also how these publications have been received or cited in the scientific community. So if you don't publish as a scientist, you're considered as not so successful. Of course, the pure number of publications doesn't necessarily tell you anything about the real content of these publications, but that's another problem. How does this actually look like when we are publishing? Well, first of all, we are working on our scientific data, we are maybe talking with a few colleagues, we are making some interesting plots and finding some really interesting things that we want to publish. So one person, or in rare cases also multiple people, will author a manuscript. This manuscript, once, for example, I think it's ready for the world, I first send it to a list of colleagues which have helped me with coming to these conclusions. That's the so-called co-authors. That might be people who contributed to the study, who were very important in funding that study, who had the idea at all to do this kind of investigations. Those people are my co-authors, and I will send my manuscript or paper directly to my co-authors and ask them for feedback on what they think I could make better or what they think I should change before submitting this manuscript to a journal. Once we have all agreed that the content is good and it's sound enough to be submitted to a scientific journal and can be judged by the wider general public, we submit it to a scientific journal. What happens next is that the editor of the scientific journal looks at this article and tries to find some international experts, independent experts who are looking at the quality of our work. So they are going to read this paper and look if they agree with the content or if not. And they will provide a letter which is called a review, in which they criticize our paper and criticize points in our paper that they don't agree with or which they think need to be changed before it can be published in scientific journal. Once they have submitted their review, the editor looks again at these reviews, and when he sees these reviews, he judges from the reviews if the paper might be suitable for publication or not. And then the editor can take a decision. So he has basically three options. He can either reject the manuscript, basically telling us that our work is not worth of publication, or he can accept it either with minor or with major revisions. If he accepts it with minor revisions, that means that only very few minor things need to be changed in the manuscript to be published. But if he accepts it with major revisions, that means that we still need to do quite a lot of work until the paper can be accepted for publication. So then I go back down with my colleagues and co-authors, and we rework the entire manuscript. We try to look at the suggestions from the reviewer, what we agree with or what maybe they didn't understand completely, and we try to optimize the manuscript so that a potential future reader can better understand what we did. And it's a very helpful process. First of all, it checks whether everything that we're saying is actually valid science, and second of all, it also helps us in presenting our stuff in a proper way, because you know that often if you have been working many years on a topic, you maybe don't clearly see the last little detail on the presentation of things, because for you everything seems very obvious, while for somebody who hears about that topic for the first time really struggles with what you have written. So then we will resubmit this to the journal, and then maybe the editors sends it out to review again. The reviewers can look again at the manuscript. Sometimes he would just accept it straight away as it is, and then a typesetter will look over it again, and eventually it will get published in a scientific journal, either online or even in print. If the reviewers are still not happy with what we did, we just repeat this cycle until the editor thinks that all raised concerns have been addressed accordingly and that the manuscript is ready for publication. If we don't manage to reach an agreement on that, it can also be that the paper is rejected at a later stage. This whole process of scientific publishing usually takes at least half a year from the initial submission, but in cases where papers discuss very controversial topics, it can go much longer, and single cases range up to even up to several years. So the longest paper I've been working on was a revision process of approximately 1.5 years. Typically, you would say within half a year, 1 year, your paper might be suitable for being published in a scientific journal. You see that getting a scientific manuscript published in a scientific journal is a quite big achievement, because it is consistently checked for errors and if everybody agrees with what you have been doing. That doesn't mean that you can't publish controversial views and you don't need to agree with everybody about what you're publishing, but there needs to be a common agreement that this is worth publishing. So once you have actually managed to publish, usually we have a small party, maybe bring a cake to the next work meeting, or if it's a paper in a very well-known journal, it might even be a real proper party, because we can celebrate this big achievement. And then after we have published it, the cycle is not over yet. We are happy, we have published something, we can put that on our CV, but there's still an ongoing quality assessment, because the real value of a paper is only gauged after when you have published it, because what really counts is how many people are reading your paper, and if they acknowledge your work, how often do they actually cite your work as being something worthy. So for us, these citations tell us really much about who reads that and also who endorses that work as proper scientific output. This works a little bit like maybe followers or likes on Twitter or in other social media, but you see it's also much more complicated. So when we publish anything, it means we have thought about it very long, and you can generally assume that it is a very high quality content. I hope you learned a little bit about how we publish and why we are all about publications when we get evaluated. So thank you very much for watching and have a nice day.